Let's speak now to one of the people who are instrumental in South Africa's hosting of the G20 Leaders Summit this past weekend in Johannesburg. That's the Department of International Relations Director General Zane Dangor. Welcome to the SABC. So good to have your time this evening. So lots of praise for South Africa's hosting of the G20 Leaders meeting, as I was saying, this past weekend, the declaration as well. And I wonder if your own expectations as Sherpa were exceeded.
Good evening. Yes, thank you for having me on. All our expectations were met. I mean, the most important milestone was that we'd set up a number of priorities, and that include the food security issues, disaster risk reduction, dealing emphatically with the issue of, the global trade. All the issues that we put on the agenda were agreed to and are in the leaders' declaration. So there's not a single issue that we put up as part of our theme that fell off the agenda. That's important. That's on the substance side. Organizing an event this size, the substance is important, and we had 130 plus meetings dealing with this over the last 12 months. But the most, you cannot get to an outcome without also organizing the process around which those discussions were held. And that's why the logistics, the communications, all of that was important. So the complete package came together. And I've got to thank the whole government. It was a whole of government approach, from communications, logistics, police, everything that brought together all the elements for such a successful summit.
Given then that the declaration, while its agreement on Saturday, on the first day of the gathering, was hailed as historic, much of it is not binding, right, because of the structure, the setup, if you will, of the G20 itself. How do we actually ensure that it's actually worth the paper that it's printed on, that meaningful action ultimately follows?
So the G20 is an informal grouping, which means that any of the agreements that we make is not binding, and we're very careful not to use legally binding words in the manner in which we craft the agreements either. But what the G20 does, it brings together some of the most influential countries in the world, and it's a ginger group that can actually influence the way in which decisions are then filtered through, both at national level, but also through other multilateral structures. So whatever the agreements the G20 makes has an important impact on, for example, what happens in binding agreements that can be taken place at your COP meetings, which deals with climate change, at ECOSOC, which deals with global health policy, global economic policy, but also just because you are bringing together these countries which makes agreements, there is a real sense that we need to be accountable to what we agreed to. So, for example, critical minerals, and for the first time that we have an agreement in the G20 that critical minerals must be beneficiated at source. While it's not binding and we've got an important agreement on this, it does lay the basis for changes in terms of the extractive industries, and that will be to the benefit of Africa and developing countries.
But ultimately, what stops the heads of state who may have sat in the room and endorsed the declaration from, as soon as they hop onto their various aircraft and go back home, changing their minds or bowing to pressures at home?
There's always a risk in democracies, especially where certain interest groups could make the implementation of agreements more difficult to implement. But I do think that the idea that we came together to make agreements is one that people will seek to work together from a perspective of accountability. It's not very easy for global leaders to shirk their responsibilities after they've actually agreed to certain measures and in the manner in which they've agreed to it, and a claim also in their own statements at the G20 meeting.
Should agreements reached by nations or their leaders at the G20, should they be made legally binding?
South Africa initiated what is called the G20 at 20. Part of what we looked at is, should we become more formalized? Should we have a secretariat, a permanent secretariat? But essentially what was agreed to was that the G20 should remain informal, because the value of the informality is that you could engage freely with each other without worrying that what we agreed to may be overly restrictive from a legal perspective. What we are doing, though, is looking at the accountability mechanisms. so that we can look at if we've agreed to, for example, in Brazil, that there should be a taxation regime that is more progressive. How do we implement that at national level? Who measures it becomes an issue. So we will measure it collectively. And this is why the continuity within the G20 is so important, that from one presidency to another, there should be means of measuring the progress and implementation of agreements.
And on continuity then, you're supposed to, as South Africa, hand over the chairpersonship, or the presidency rather, of the G20 to the United States. We know that's come with its fair bit of drama in the last week or so. Do you expect that continuity that you reference to face genuine threat?
I think there will be a scaled down G20 presidency by the US. They will focus on a much more narrow set of issues. They will focus on deregulation, a narrow approach to growth. So what we've done is sort of future-proofed our own G20 presidency. So we've got a standalone document on inequality that UNECA, the World Bank, and other institutions can take forward. We also had a very good report that emerged from the work that former Minister Trevor Manuel did, and that is also future-proofed because this can be taken up by research institutions, the World Bank, and others as well.
But can the G20, informal as it is, be a fully functional and stable grouping of countries when ultimately, just based on what you're saying, there have to now be workarounds put in place so that another member of the G20 who you would expect to participate in good faith does not demolish the work of the predecessor, in essence?
Yeah, so every presidency has the prerogative to determine what the agenda would be and the priorities would be, but there are always certain issues that remain on the agenda to ensure continuity. Climate change is one of those. What we do foresee is that, given the fact that next year's agenda will be scaled down, and it's the right of the US to do that, we hope that when the UK and South Korea does take over in subsequent years, that the agenda will be taken up again. And we can then pull through in terms of the agreements on measurement of implementation of the agreements that we've just made over the last 4 years, where the Sustainable Development Agenda and now the African Agenda has become center to the G20.
And what sort of coexistence then, before we get to the UK in 2027, etc., then leading or presiding over the G20 in the year of the Americans and the Trump presidency, what do you see as the level of cooperation, perhaps coexistence, between South Africa and Washington within the framework of the G20, and as DG of the International Relations Department, the broader relationship between the two countries, which has really continued to take strain?
So in the G20, South Africa is a full member of the G20. Presidencies have the prerogative to invite what we call invited countries or guest countries. But with G20 members, there's always the full expectation that they will be participating. I think we will participate fully. We will contribute to the agenda. And of course, make sure that from our perspective, the continuity of the Sustainable Development Agenda, that we've just sharpened following what India, Brazil, and Indonesia has done, continues. Hopefully, there is space to do that. On the broader relationships, we continue to work on that. I think if one looks at the reasons offered for the US not attending, it's all to do with their perceptions, largely based on misinformation on what is happening in our domestic space, particularly with our transformation agenda. We will continue to explain that our transformation agenda is core to us for our country, that it's actually a centerpiece of our constitution. Transformation is required. Transformative constitutionalism is something that we have to continue. We've got to deal with the inequality within our country. And we will explain that to the US, and hopefully within the parameters of the discussions at the G20 itself, these kinds of issues can also be discussed at a bilateral level, but also in the context of multilateralism.
Zane Dangor, good to talk to you, Director General in the Department of International Relations. Thank you for your time.